Right now, inside a conference room at Microsoft headquarters, someone is staring at a chart they never thought they would have to explain. A chart showing Windows quietly bleeding market share on the one battlefield it has never had to defend in over 2 decades, PC gaming. And the thing taking that ground is not some billion-dollar startup with a flashy launch event. It is Linux, the operating system gamers have joked about switching to for 20 years without ever actually doing it. Except this time the joke stopped being a joke, because in March of 2026, according to Valve's own official Steam hardware survey, Linux crossed 5%. Market share among Steam users for the very first time in the platform's entire history. And if that number sounds small, sit with it a second, because just 2 years earlier, in 2024, Linux was barely scratching 2% of that same survey, which means in roughly 18 months, Linux more than doubled its footprint on the largest PC gaming storefront on the planet, and doubling is not a rounding error, it's an acceleration. And accelerations are exactly the kind of thing that keep technology executives awake at night. But the raw growth number is only half the story, because the more revealing detail is where those new Linux users came from. And during that same window, Windows 10 usage among Steam players dropped by nearly 15%, while Windows 11 only absorbed about 10.5% of new users. And if everyone leaving Windows 10 had simply migrated to Windows 11, those numbers should have roughly canceled out, but they did not. There is a real, measurable gap. A chunk of former Windows 10 users who did not upgrade at all, they left the Microsoft ecosystem completely. And a meaningful portion of them landed on Linux. So the real question worth asking is why this is happening right now, after 2 decades of Windows enjoying an almost unquestioned monopoly over PC gaming. And the honest answer is that this story has both a stick pushing people away and a carrot pulling them somewhere new. So let's start with the stick. Because Microsoft built a meaningful part of this problem on its own, Windows 10 officially reached its end of support in October of 2025. And Microsoft's recommended path forward was simple on paper: upgrade to Windows 11, enroll in extended security updates, or replace your hardware if it fails the newer, stricter system requirements. And for millions of gamers running perfectly capable machines that technically failed Windows 11's hardware checklist, that landed less like helpful guidance and more like being told to buy a new computer just to keep playing the games they already owned. And even gamers who could upgrade without issue often found Windows 11 itself a frustrating, increasingly bloated experience, background processes eating into system resources, forced updates interrupting play sessions at the wrong moment, and an aggressive push toward built-in AI features most gamers never asked for. And the blunt, unflattering nickname frustrated users started throwing around online by early 2026 tells you everything about how much goodwill had eroded. Now let's talk about the carrot, because Microsoft's own self-inflicted wounds only explain half of what is happening here, and the other half belongs almost entirely to one company and one piece of hardware that quietly changed everything: Valve and the Steam Deck. When Valve launched the Steam Deck back in 2022, running its own Linux-based operating system called Steam OS, plenty of skeptics assumed it would go the exact same way as Valve's original Steam machines from 2015, an ambitious idea eventually crushed by a tiny game library and a frustrating, incomplete experience. And that earlier attempt failed for one brutally simple reason: there was no realistic way to run the massive existing library of Windows games on Linux, so almost nobody had a genuine reason to switch. And the Steam Deck solved that exact problem, and the piece of software that made it possible is called Proton, a compatibility layer built by Valve that acts as a sophisticated translator sitting between a Windows game and the Linux system underneath it, intercepting every call that game makes toward Windows and converting it on the fly into instructions Linux can actually understand. And this might sound like a small technical footnote, but it is genuinely the single most important piece of software in this entire story, because without it, none of what has happened would have been remotely possible, and Proton has gotten remarkably good enough that a huge number of games now run just as well on Linux as Windows, and in some documented cases, actually better. And that last detail deserves to sit with you for a moment, because it flips the traditional argument for sticking with Windows completely upside down. For decades, the unquestioned assumption was that Windows offered the best gaming performance simply because developers optimized for Windows first. So if Linux, running a translation layer on an operating system never designed with gaming in mind, can match or beat native Windows performance in a meaningful number of cases, that tells you something is going seriously wrong inside Microsoft's own house. Valve is not the only force driving this shift either. A gaming-focused Linux distribution called Bazite has seen genuinely massive growth over the same period, and other established distributions, including Arch Linux and the beginner-friendly Linux Mint, have also picked up meaningful chunks of that same growing pool of Steam users, showing this is not simply a story about one company's hardware. It is a broader ecosystem effect, with the Steam Deck acting as the spark. For literally decades, dedicated enthusiasts have promised that this would finally be the year Linux gaming broke through, only for that promise to quietly fizzle out year after year, usually because of the same core problem: a fraction of the available game library, clunky drivers, and a steep technical learning curve that scared away anyone not comfortable typing commands into a terminal. And what makes 2026 fundamentally different is that the core problem underlying all of those failed attempts has actually been solved this time. Because Proton did not simply improve marginally, it fundamentally changed the economics of the situation by removing the requirement that developers do any extra work at all to support Linux, and that shift from requiring active developer effort to requiring essentially none is exactly the kind of structural change that turns a permanently stalled trend into a genuinely accelerating one. And there is also a psychological piece of this story that is easy to underestimate, because the Steam Deck did something that 20 years of Linux advocacy on forums never managed to accomplish. It made millions of ordinary, non-technical gamers use Linux every single day without most of them ever realizing it. And that casual, invisible exposure quietly built comfort and trust at a genuinely massive scale. This is exactly where things start to escalate into something that could genuinely accelerate hard over the next year, because Valve has been developing an entirely new piece of hardware called the Steam Machine, a compact living room-focused console running the same SteamOS foundation as the Steam Deck, but built for full desktop-level gaming performance connected to your television. And it started shipping in the summer of 2026, priced around $1,049, packing a semi-custom AMD processor, a dedicated graphics chip, 16 gigabytes of memory, and up to 2 terabytes of storage. And here's why the Steam Machine matters so much more than the original failed 2015 version. It comes down to timing and maturity. Back in 2015, SteamOS was immature, Proton did not exist in usable form, and buyers correctly concluded they'd lose most of their existing library, so they stuck with Windows. In 2026, that calculation has flipped. SteamOS has been hardened across millions of real-world Steam Deck units over 4 straight years, and Proton now handles the overwhelming majority of the Windows catalog without any extra work from developers. But let's be honest about the one genuine weakness still standing in the way of this entire ecosystem, because pretending Linux gaming is a flawless, finished product would be dishonest, and that weakness is called kernel-level anti-cheat, the single biggest remaining obstacle standing between SteamOS and true mainstream dominance, because many popular competitive multiplayer games rely on anti-cheat software running deep inside the operating system's kernel, the most privileged layer of the system. And these systems were built almost exclusively around Windows' own security architecture, which works fundamentally differently than the Linux kernel, and bridging that gap requires real engineering work, and in some cases, publishers trusting an operating system they do not fully control the way they control Windows. And as of the middle of 2026, several of the most popular competitive shooters in the world remain either partially or completely unplayable on Linux because of this gap. So if your gaming life revolves around anti-cheat protected competitive titles, Linux genuinely is not yet a complete replacement for Windows. That said, the trend line here has been moving in the right direction. Valve has been actively working with publishers to smooth over exactly this friction, and every publisher that enables proper Linux anti-cheat support makes the platform more attractive to the next wave of switchers, creating a positive feedback loop that could meaningfully accelerate this shift. Here is a detail that gets lost in a lot of the coverage. Valve has explicitly signaled that it wants SteamOS to spread well beyond its own official hardware. The operating system already runs on a growing number of third-party handheld devices, and recent updates have added official support for installing SteamOS directly onto ordinary desktop PCs, not just Valve's own machines. And that matters enormously because Valve is deliberately positioning SteamOS as a genuine general-purpose alternative operating system that any PC gamer could install on hardware they already own, sitting right alongside Windows as a real choice. And as of the middle of 2026, more than 19,000 individual Steam games carry an official verified or playable compatibility rating for the Steam Deck, a genuinely enormous slice of Steam's overall catalog, spanning tiny indie experiments to massive AAA releases. And this also matters for how third-party hardware manufacturers think about their own product lines, because they now have a low-risk opportunity to build their own SteamOS-powered machines, essentially treating SteamOS the way Android treats smartphones, an operating system any manufacturer can adopt rather than something locked to one company's devices. And that comparison to Android is worth sitting with, because Android became dominant by giving dozens of manufacturers a genuinely good free operating system to build around. And if SteamOS follows even a fraction of that playbook, the long-term threat to Windows becomes significantly larger than today's modest market share. Numbers suggest Though PC gaming is a different situation from early smartphones, Windows sits on decades of accumulated software compatibility and deeply ingrained habit, so any meaningful transition is almost certainly going to be measured in years, possibly decades. Let's zoom out and talk about why this genuinely should worry Microsoft strategically, because Windows has never really had to compete for the PC gaming market. For over 2 decades, if you wanted to play PC games, Windows was effectively the only option. And that dominance let Microsoft treat gamers as a captive audience, an assumption baked so deeply into its strategy that updates could prioritize enterprise customers, cloud services, and AI features without fear gamers would leave, because there was nowhere else to go. And that assumption is exactly what is breaking down right now. Handheld gaming has already become a space where Steam OS demonstrably beats Windows on its own turf, with smoother interfaces, better sleep and resume functionality, and lower system overhead. And Microsoft has clearly noticed, publicly working on gaming-focused versions of Windows for handheld devices, but playing catch-up against a rival with 4 years of real-world refinement is a genuinely difficult position. And if living room gaming PCs follow the same pattern handheld gaming already has, Microsoft could face an uncomfortable long-term scenario. Not Windows disappearing entirely, that remains extremely unlikely, but something arguably more threatening. Windows slowly reduced to background infrastructure for a shrinking segment of PC gaming, while Steam itself, running on Steam OS rather than Windows, becomes the platform that actually defines the mainstream experience. And in that scenario, Microsoft does not lose PC gaming in one dramatic moment. It simply becomes gradually less relevant to it year after year, while Valve quietly becomes the platform gamers think about first. It is worth being genuinely balanced here too, because Linux's momentum has not been a smooth, uninterrupted climb, after hitting that record high of just over 5%. In March of 2026, Linux's market share on Steam pulled back over the following 2 months, dropping to around 4.5% in April and closer to 4% by May, while Windows 11 clawed back a meaningful chunk of users, and some of that recovery appears to be a direct response to real pressure, with Microsoft publicly announcing a renewed commitment to Windows quality, promising fewer disruptive updates and better performance. And whether that commitment sticks long-term or was a temporary reaction to a scary-looking chart is something only time will tell. But this back and forth tells you something important. This is not some inevitable, unstoppable march. It is a genuine competition, with both sides actively responding to each other, exactly the kind of healthy pressure PC gaming has been missing for 2 decades. And Microsoft improving Windows in response to Linux's gains is not evidence the threat is fake. It is evidence the threat is real enough to force a genuine strategic response from one of the largest technology companies on the planet. It is worth talking honestly about who this shift genuinely benefits, because not every gamer should rush out and switch tomorrow. If most of your gaming time is spent on single-player titles, older classics, indie games, or multiplayer titles that already have solid confirmed Proton support, switching to SteamOS today could feel close to seamless, but if your gaming life revolves around anti-cheat protected competitive titles that remain unsupported on Linux, you should wait and watch how quickly that gap closes. And there is also an important structural point buried underneath all of this. Every one of these gains is happening specifically because Valve built and actively maintains Proton as genuinely excellent software. Not because Linux itself suddenly became easy for the average non-technical user to set up. SteamOS packages up all of that complexity into something simple and consumer-friendly, hiding the traditional Linux learning curve behind a clean, controller-friendly interface. And that distinction matters, because this is not really a story about Linux as a general concept becoming mainstream on its own. It is much more specifically a story about one company, Valve, building an unusually good, well-funded product on top of Linux. So here is the honest, grounded takeaway. Should Microsoft be afraid exactly as dramatically as that phrase implies, not in the sense of Windows collapsing next year or even within 5 years? Because the sheer scale of Windows installed base and its deep entrenchment give it an enormous amount of built-in staying power that does not evaporate overnight. But should Microsoft genuinely be paying close, serious attention, treating this as a real long-term strategic threat rather than a rounding error? Absolutely. And the fact that Microsoft has already started publicly responding with promises of better Windows quality and gaming-focused handheld software tells you the company itself already agrees, whether or not it says so directly. And the real story is not really Linux beating Windows in some dramatic showdown. It is competition finally returning to a corner of the industry that had gone without any for the better part of 2 decades. And what that means for you, the actual gamer, regardless of which logo shows up when your computer boots, because genuine competition pushes every company toward better products and more respect for what users actually want. And that alone, independent of who ultimately wins the largest share, is a good thing for everyone who plays PC games. And one last thought, 20 years from now, people may look back at this exact period. The Steam Deck's slow burn success, Proton quietly maturing, and the Steam Machine arriving to test whether the living room accepts what the handheld already proved, as the moment the PC gaming monopoly started to crack, or it may simply fade into another footnote in a long history of Linux almost breaking through before stalling out again. And nobody watching this today knows for certain which version of that story we are living through. What we do know is that for the first time in over 20 years, the question is genuinely worth asking at all, and that alone is a remarkable shift from where PC gaming stood just a few short years ago.